awesome. You've already heard my spiel, so I'm not going to say too much. We've got Josh Lejeune coming next Sunday. He's was over 400 pounds. He's lost 220 pounds, and he's a marathon runner now. So he's a really great person, down to earth and funny. So he's going to be here next Sunday. We still have a few tickets for our Italian night that we hold the last Wednesday of every month. So if you haven't tried that before, that's a lot of fun. And we continue to do the Kickstart program every month. We've had close to 1,000 people go through that now, which is pretty exciting. One of our Kickstarters this month started at 420 pounds, and in the first week he lost 20 pounds.
Wow.
So it works. And it's very cool. I think it's almost a miracle for us to see these things happen on a day-to-day basis. Green Fair was just awarded something called the Good Food 100 Awards. It's a James Beard sponsored award for restaurants that do great food. So they look at things organic and sustainable practices. But out of 1,600 applicants, we were the only restaurant in Virginia to win one of these, one out of 100 awards for the country. So we're thrilled to get that. And so I'm thrilled today to bring Chuck Carrol from the Exam Room. He does his million follower podcast, I think, on, is it just examroom.org?
Yeah, Exam Room by the Physicians Committee.
By PCRM. So if you haven't listened to that, subscribe to that. He's got all kinds of interesting people on there.
Including you.
I was on there once. He did one for me. Chuck's agreed to be at our Veg Fest 2020, which is going to be April 19th, this 2020. So we're excited about that. And then I'm thrilled to have Dr. Jim Loomis here, a good friend and director of the Bernard Medical Center from St. Louis, where he took the two teams to the World Series and the Super Bowl, and now is a marathon Ironman himself. And so please give a welcome to Chuck and
to do this, man. Before we get going, Game Changers is doing just remarkably well, isn't it?
Oh, it's astounding, really. When I found out that in like 6 days it was the fastest or the highest selling documentary iTunes had ever had, and then shortly thereafter the top selling independent film. And now on Netflix as of the 16th.
That is the power of plants, my friend.
You are correct.
Has everybody seen Game Changers here? Yeah? Great film. Yeah. Clap it up. Clap it up. Okay, well, if you'll indulge us for a little while as you enjoy your wonderful tasty dinner, we're going to talk a little bit about athletes and nutrition, a little bit more about the film. Obviously, Dr. Loomis was in there, and he has the background, as Glenn mentioned, with the St. Louis Cardinals and the Rams while they were still in St. Louis. You didn't follow them to LA? I hear LA is wonderful while Washington winters are so cold. So, all right. Well, we're going to get going. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome to a very special on-location edition of the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee with the weight loss champion, Chuck Carrol. I am so thrilled to be once again sitting next to the man, the myth, the legend from Game Changers, and he is the director of the Barnard Medical Center, Dr. Jim Loomis. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chuck. Always a pleasure.
Nice ovation from the crowd here at Green Fair. What a wonderful restaurant this is out here in Reston, Virginia, just about a stone's throw away from Dulles Airport. If you're ever in the Washington area, you're listening to this and you're not in the DC area, I highly recommend flying into Dulles, and on your way into the city, stop in Reston, stop at Green Fair. Gwen and Pericles and the crew here will get you set up with some of the most delicious whole food, plant-based meals that you have ever eaten in your entire life.
It's amazing food. Salt-free, sugar-free, oil-free. It will cure what ails you.
Everything the body needs to be the ideal athlete, correct?
That is correct.
And that is what we're talking about today. The Game Changers film recently released on iTunes, now streaming worldwide on Netflix. This is super exciting because, as I understand it, Dr. Loomis, this film is just burning up the charts.
Yeah, Chuck, it's really pretty remarkable. I'm on a number of like marathon Facebook groups, for example, and you're seeing questions popping up about game changers in where
It really is a phenomenal film, and I really documentary out there. I think that this is the next what the hell is mine, who still works there. He hit me up and he was like, "Bro, science shell at a sports talk station. You know you've put together something special."
Yeah, that's great to hear.
So here it is Sunday, and you have a background, obviously, as a physician, formerly in the NFL and Major League Baseball and a few other places, but let's focus on the athletics here. It's Sunday. There are NFL games being played across the country. My first question to you is, how are these guys going to be feeling in the morning?
Well, football is a brutal sport. And I think that Derek Morgan in the film says the injury rate in the NFL is 100%. And it's true. It is such a brutal sport. Even if it's not, more significant injury like tearing your ACL, these guys just get beat up every single Sunday. And the cumulative effect over the season is, by week 10, week 11, there's a line to get in the ice bath, and it's pretty brutal.
Yeah, I've covered professional football for a number of years, and I've told you previously on the show, having the opportunity to interview a player who was plant-based. He was here in Washington for a while, a gentleman by the name of DJ Swearinger, and this was late in the season. You're talking about a line for an ice bath. This is like there's 1 week to go in the year, and these guys can barely shuffle their feet. And yet here's DJ just bounding down the stairs with all of this energy, skipping toward the table to do this interview, and proudly demonstrates his amazing smoothie station that they had installed for him out there at the training facility. And he's like, "Dude, it's the plants."
Yeah, and that's what you hear. Every athlete, again, when you take a look at the Tennessee Titans, at first when Derek went plant-based, his teammates were making fun of him.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, halfway through the season, he's not in the training room all the time. He's able to hit the weights on the off days and train harder. He's recovering faster. His performance on the field is escalated. And all of a sudden, these same guys that are making fun of him are coming up to him and say, "Hey, now what is it you're doing again?" And it's very interesting. At the LA Red Carpet premiere of Game Changers, I had the opportunity to talk to Chris Paul, who's an NBA All-Star.
Famous.
Yeah, now with Oklahoma, I believe. And he's, I think, 35, and he's had some injury issues in the past. And he's fairly recently had gone plant-based, and he told me probably the most amazing statement I've heard from an athlete. He said that he didn't want to tell his teammates or the other players in the league he had gone plant-based, not because he was concerned they'd make fun of him, which is what it would have been a few years ago. It was because he felt like he got such a competitive advantage, he didn't want to give away the secret. Seriously. And you think about that, wow, right?
Yeah.
Wow. And it's just food. Right?
35. That's old for professional athlete standards. You think of Chris Paul, but then you think in the NFL, you look at Tom Brady up in New England. 42.
Yeah, right.
42. The guy is still winning Super Bowls. It's amazing.
Right.
It's amazing. I just had an opportunity to be in a game, cover that one a few weeks ago when he was here in town, and he comes walking into the media room afterward, and he does not look 42 years old. This guy looks like he's 32, maybe even 31. It's unbelievable.
Right.
Let's get a little bit nerdy, shall we? Let's dive into the science of why Tom Brady looks young, why Chris Paul wanted that competitive advantage, why you were able to do an Ironman triathlon, my friend. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into this, but I think first of all, we need to understand what happens to the body when you're eating that standard American diet. A word that gets tossed around an awful lot is inflammation.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, so I think that there's really two advantages to a plant-based diet as far as athletic performance goes. So one is it really does present the optimum fuel for an athlete. There's a misperception when protein is what makes us drives our athletic performance, but in fact it's carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. That's what we use to fuel our exercise. Exercise up to a couple of hours. Maybe 2.5 hours, more intense exercise. That's all carbohydrate. And inherently, a whole food plant-based diet is about 75% unprocessed carbs. And carbs have gotten a bad rap these days.
Haven't they though?
And I think that's just a symptom of the fact we've stopped talking about food. We talk about what food's made out of. 30 years ago, we were worshiping carbs, kind of the era of Snackwell's cookies, right? Remember that? It was like free food, right? You could eat a whole package because, hey, it's fat-free, right? And if you look at the obesity epidemic we see in this country, it starts to, that's about when it starts to creep up. And carbs aren't the problem, it's the package that carbs come in, right? When you take the difference between an apple, say, and apple juice, right?
Right.
Our bodies have to do work to digest the apple, extract the energy, and all this good. So, and when we underconsume carbs as an athlete, you can become chronically glycogen depleted, and that can lead to fatigue. And if you're a runner, you've heard of marathoners hitting the wall. That's because you actually run out of glycogen. That's what triggers that. So the macronutrient ratios in a plant-based diet are exactly what you need to perform. And in fact, we can talk a little bit more about, if you look at it through the lens of our kind of evolutionary biology, which we can talk about in a minute, it does really replicate what's felt to be ancestral diets. But the other huge benefit, and across the board, and my own personal experience as well, it's the ability to enhance recovery. And that primarily has to do with the fact that the diet is so highly anti-inflammatory. Mm-hmm. And we get inflammation from two sources. So one is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in our body. The omega-6s create inflammation, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. It's felt the optimum ratio is probably 3 to 1, omega-6 to omega-3. Standard American diet, it can be 50 to 1. So, we've got this low-burning fire in our bodies all the time. Exercise is an inflammatory event. So now, you go play a football game, you go run a marathon, you're just throwing gas on the fire, right? So no wonder that people can't walk the next day. Okay. And when we, on the other hand, when we eat a whole food plant-based diet where that omega-3, omega-6 ratio is back down into that, what's felt to be the optimum range, well now we've got water to put on the fire when we exercise. And then the other part of it is oxidative stress. We burn oxygen for fuel, that creates oxygen-free radicals. In small doses, they play an important role in cell signaling. When we start to exercise, for example, we burn more oxygen, so oxidative stress goes up, that sends a signal to our muscles, hey, I'm getting ready to damage you, so fix me when I'm done. But in excess amounts, it actually is felt to be the cause of the delayed onset muscle soreness, the stiffness that you see after a hard athletic event, and if that's sustained, it can actually increase your risk for coronary artery disease. The lipid particles can become oxidized, which make them more reactive with the blood vessel wall. It's been shown to damage DNA and can lead to cataracts and diabetes and cancer and on and on and on. And again, the only place we can get antioxidants to help mitigate the oxidative stress is through our diet, and they only occur in plants.
So we're talking about a couple of things stood out to me there. You said that diabetes was one that stood out to me, and coronary heart disease. And here's where I'm going with this. Because now I'm thinking about, well, what is it that these players are eating before kickoff? What is the pregame meal? I mean, you were a team physician for a while. What fuel are they putting in their bodies before the game right now?
So, you go to the pregame meal in football. It's typically about 8 o'clock in the morning, somewhere in there for a noon game. And there would be a spread. They would have steak and chicken breasts and pasta, right? You got to get some carbs. You got to get your protein, right? But even day to day, you go to the training room. There's big blenders all around the weight room with whey protein and such as that. And because there's this mythology again around protein and strength and meat and on. And it as was shown in the movie Game Changers, when we eat those high-fat meals, the scene with the blood that was clouded.
Yeah.
That fat impairs our performance because you can imagine that blood flow is much more sluggish when it's full of that fat, and it impairs our ability to recover, on and on and on. So, and really, the amazing thing is that there's no one diet to prevent breast cancer. and there's not another diet to prevent diabetes, and another diet to perform optimally, and another diet because you're compassionate about animals, and another diet because you care about the environment. That's really the beauty of a whole food plant-based diet. Because, in fact, if you follow a whole food plant-based diet, it has been shown to prevent and reverse heart disease and prevent diabetes and may reduce your risk or prevent certain cancers, and it's good for the environment and it's good for the animals, and by the way, it's good for athletic performance. So that's really the beauty of the whole thing, really. It's the simplicity of it. It's not easy for people that are transitioning necessarily, but it's certainly easy. It's such a simple concept.
It's definitely a cover all. I think that's the term that that's a football term, by the way, defense. So question for you. So that's what players are eating now, by and large. And those pregame meals, I'm sure, are very similar today to what they were when you were still with the Rams. That's very different from what our ancestors used to eat back in the day. Our ancestral diet was quite different, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that's interesting. When I tried to understand this, when I transitioned to a plant-based diet in 2011, and I had really profound personal health improvements. I lost about 70 pounds total, but a lot of that was toward the end with the Ironman training this last year. I lost about 10 or 15 of that. I dropped my cholesterol 100 points. I reversed. I had sleep apnea, and atrial fibrillation, and exercise-induced asthma, all of which went away.
And you were a doctor.
I was a doctor.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
So as I tried to really understand why just that simple change in my lifestyle had such a profound effect, I did a ton of reading, and and what struck me is that we're all designed to be athletes. If you think about what we had to do to survive, like any living creature, all of our behavior, our nutritional needs, our metabolism evolved to help us accomplish the singular task of trying to hang around long enough and find a mate and pass on our DNA. And historically, to do that, we had to be able to do two things. We had to be able to go find food when we're starving, and not be someone else's food when they're starving. And that's where our stress came from, right? And we had to react to that stress through physical activity. So we evolved a stress response. Adrenaline gets us ready to exercise, and cortisol helps us recover. And assuming we survive, that's when we rest, recover, and refuel. And we refuel with what we can find around us on a given day. And this concept that our ancestors were hunter-gatherers is wrong. In temperate climates, there's clear evidence that our ancestors were not hunter-gatherers. We were gatherer-hunters. But what did we gather? We gathered primarily whole food, unprocessed, plant-based sources of energy, right? Roots and stems and leaves and seeds and fruits and nuts and vegetables and berries and legumes. I mean, there was no white flower tree or canola oil bush or Dr. Pepper nut, right? We're not designed to use dairy products, except our mother's milk.
Right.
Dairy is a biologic fluid that takes baby mammals and turns them into big mammals. And once the mammal's big enough to find food on its own, we don't need our mother's milk anymore. We did eat meat historically. It just wasn't very much. But the meat we ate came from wild animals, not animal stuff full of corn and antibiotics and hormones, which really profoundly changes the nutritional value of the food. A corn-finished cow, the omega-3 content of the meat goes down to 0 within a week. And it's all omega-6, highly inflammatory. Now, I think I'm not advocating for grass-fed beef, because I think that our ancestors probably did have a survival advantage to having that concentrated animal fat protein to get big and strong and get away from the leopard before they died of infectious disease when they were 30.
Right.
So they never had to worry about, if I ate too much red meat, am I going to get cancer or diabetes, because they're already dead. And so through sanitation and antibiotics, we tripled our lifespan. And so we have unmasked all these chronic problems, all of which are associated with the overconsumption of animal fat, animal protein, et cetera. And then you take one step further back and think about the environmental consequences of how we raise animals and how we treat animals. I think you can make a very, very strong argument, if you're not starved for calories, that a whole food plant-based diet is the optimum diet for human health, planetary health, et cetera. And so if you look at the components of kind of what an ancestral diet looked like, very high in fiber. Average American today gets 15-20 grams of fiber a day. We're probably designed to get north of 75. And 75 shown to it's like a miracle drug. It reverses prevents pressure and cholesterol and prevents cancer and controls weight and on and on and on. It was very low in fat and especially saturated fat because the wild animals we ate were wild animals. It was very high in antioxidants.
Right.
It was very, very much anti-inflammatory because it had a very low omega-6, omega-3 ratio. It was very low in salt and very high in potassium. And so that's why that ratio of potassium to sodium has been shown to lower blood pressure. So, and again, if you think about that diet, that's exactly the optimum diet for athletic performance. It's the same thing. So, and again, it's this idea, we are all designed to be athletes, right? You carry the groceries in from the car, you're being an athlete. You carry the laundry up from the basement, you're being an athlete. You give your kid a piggyback ride, you're being an athlete. Now, some people are more athletic than others.
Oh, dude, I do a lot of chores, man. I got gold medals.
But to meet your needs, it's just calories that you have to worry about. It's not. Now there might be some very nuanced. If you're a bodybuilder cutting for a show, or you're running an Ironman, you want a carb load or something like that. There's some very nuanced dietary changes, manipulations you can make. But for 99% of the people, there's no such thing as sports nutrition. It's just a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet, and it's just the number of calories you consume is all we need to focus on.
Well, let's go back to the kind of the ancestral diet and then look at where we are today, because that is a dramatic shift. How did we get from there to where we are today?
Right, there's been profound changes in the Western diet in the last 50, 75 years. Sugar consumption, right? On average, we've seen a decline in table sugar consumption, sucrose, but that's been more than per capita. We eat 100 pounds of sugar per person. So what that means is on January 1st, you got a family of 4, you bring in 4 100-pound bags of sugar, and each week you scoop out 2 pounds for everyone in the house. And people will say, well, I don't do that in my house, but we do it. Because we have, maybe not the people here in this audience, but in general we do, because we've hidden this sugar in everything, right? It's in cereal, it's in tomato, it's in ketchup, it's in bread, it's in sports drinks. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. Milk consumption. Again, we're not designed to use dairy. We have seen a decline in whole milk consumption, but especially full fat milk. But when we take the fat out of the milk, we're going to make cheese out of it. That cheese consumption skyrocketed, about 45 pounds per capita, per person per year.
That's a lot of cheese.
It is a lot of cheese. And the problem is, because of the way we make cheese today, that exposes us to hormones and antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria and all kinds of nasty things. We eat about 150 pounds of meat a year. And again, but the meat we eat today, it bears no resemblance to the meat that we were designed to eat evolutionarily. And what's interesting is, there was a study that came out in, I think, Cell Metabolism a couple years ago that showed that people who overconsume animal protein, most people overconsume protein in general,
right,
in particular animal protein, they have a 4 times greater risk dying from cancer, right? The smoker has a 2 times greater risk. So it's actually more detrimental to your health to overconsume animal protein than it is to smoke cigarettes.
Holy cow.
And there's a lot of theories as to why. It probably has to do with overstimulation of insulin growth like factor 1, especially found in high concentrations in dairy, on and on. And then lastly, we've seen a huge increase in edible oils. There has been a fairly significant decrease in animal oils, like lard. I remember growing up, I grew up in the South, and we had a coffee can on the stove where you would put all the bacon grease.
Yes, sir.
And you would use that to fry the eggs and put in the greens and everything, right?
And the big cereal.
No, that's right. And there was a big chunk of lard that my grandmother would make biscuits with, and on and on. So that consumption has gone down, but it's been more than offset by increased consumption of vegetable oils. And that's why I think it's important, and why I, with patients, make a clear distinction between a plant-based diet and a vegan diet. Veganism comes historically from an ethical place.
Right.
And it's a good thing. It's about not using animal products tested on animals, not wearing products made from animals. However, there's a lot of really unhealthy stuff that's vegan. That's like oils, for example.
Yeah.
And one reason, so we talked earlier about the omega-6, omega-3 ratios. Corn oil has an 83 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Right? That's probably one of the most highly inflammatory oils that are out there. But what do we feed cows? They mix corn oil in with the feed to fatten the cows. And so that's where the inflammation comes from in industrially raised animals today. Even olive oil is, I think, 16 to 3 or 13 to 3, something like that. Higher than that 5 to 1 ratio that we need, we're looking for, or 3 to 1. So, and again, I think the other issue besides the changes in diet I alluded to earlier is this idea of, we've stopped talking about food. We don't know what food is anymore. We don't know where our food comes from. We don't know the dirt we grow the food in. We don't know what we put in the dirt. We don't know how we process it after we harvest it. We don't know why we crave it. And we don't know what it does to our bodies after. Right. I mean, we've learned as a society that McDonald's tastes good, McDonald's is cheap, McDonald's is convenient. I got to get the kids to soccer practice, so I'm just going to go to McDonald's without ever stopping to think did I feed myself or my kids food or not? And Michael Pollan, the food writer, would argue, no, those are edible food-like substances, because if you really thought about it, when you went through the drive-thru McDonald's, what you would be ordering would be is colon cancer with large fries and a double bypass with cheese and diabetes with a large soda. I mean, seriously, but that's not how we think about food. And then, then we talked a little bit about the nutrition reductionism early, that we talk about what food's made out of. We talk about carbs and protein and fat, and carbs are not the problem, and protein is, not something magic. It's not a magic pill. It's part of when we shift the dialogue back to food, then we don't have to worry about it.
Protein. You mentioned that a number of times just now. And I think that particularly with athletes, which we're talking about today, it's, well, are you getting enough protein? Is it even possible to get enough protein on a plant-based diet? And I think that everybody here who, when they first went plant-based, they had somebody ask them the question, say it with me, where do you get your protein? Right? So we know where we get the protein from. This is a plant-based audience, but how much protein do we actually need? You said that the average person now is getting 4 times what's recommended?
That's about right. Well, first of all, when people ask me that question, I just ask them, well, did you turn on, last time you turned on National Geographic and saw a special on mountain gorillas or elephants, was the first thing you worried about was where they were getting their protein, right? Probably not, right? So I get my protein the same place they do. Unlike, when we consume excess carbohydrate, we can store that. We store that as glycogen in our muscle liver. Again, that's for fuel. Anything that's left over, it gets sent back to the liver to be converted to triglyceride, where it can be stored as fat. The fat we convert to triglyceride, stored as fat. But protein, we can't store extra protein. Mm-hmm. So once we kind of repaired our tissue and kind of day-to-day maintenance, we convert the protein to nitrogen, and it's excreted in our urine. And so we can measure that. And so the point where and so there's a lot of studies that the RDA, recommended daily allowance for protein for the average person is about 0.8, 0.9 grams per kilogram. Okay. Athletes do need more protein. An endurance athlete, the range is about 1 to about 1.5. The strength athletes, about 1.6, 1.5, 1.6, maybe up to 2. Okay? So, as I said earlier, the natural macronutrient ratios of a plant-based diet are 75% unprocessed carbs, 15% protein, 10% fat. So there's 4 calories per gram of protein, and 4 calories per gram of carb, and 9 per fat. But if you do the math backwards, so say your average kind of activity level, and you're eating maybe 1,800, 2,000 calories a day, and you weigh kind of average size, 75, 80 kilos. If you do that math backwards, okay, 15% protein in a 2,000 calorie diet for someone who weighs 80 kilos is 0.9 grams per kilogram. Okay, right where you need to be, right? So I just finished an Ironman a couple months ago. And I can guarantee you, I wasn't eating 4,000 calories a day. 2,000 calories a day. Right. I was probably eating 4,000 calories a day because I was working out 3 hours a day on the weekdays and 5, 6, 7 hours on the weekends. So what happens when I move my caloric intake from 2,000 to 4,000? Well, my protein intake is doubled. So now it's 1.6. Well, what does an endurance athlete need? 1.6 grams per kilogram. So it's calories are the key. It's not protein, it's not carbs, it's calories. And that's the beauty. If you eat a whole food plant-based diet, you are going to get the optimum ratio of calories. And if you eat enough calories to match your caloric output, then you'll be fine. And I have a slide I give in my talks that I stopped by the protein deficiency ward at the hospital on the way here, and it was empty. But I think that we obsess about protein. It's you can get water now that's infused with protein. Believe it or not, you can get protein water. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's really insane.
Okay, so in all honesty, you are not the first physician to tell me that protein deficiency is nearly non-existent. In your entire time practicing, have you ever come across a patient who was protein deficient?
No. Well, I mean, so I've seen a couple patients that were elderly and dying of cancer and completely malnourished, but no one's ever walked in the office no one has ever walked in the office and been diagnosed with protein deficiency. These are people that are terminally ill and malnourished. No one has ever come in and been protein deficient.
Right.
Yes.
Let me throw you a curveball then, because I think that if you talk to sports nutritionists who haven't actually gone to school to be a nutritionist and get all of their information from a magazine, they will tell you that you need to eat meat in order to get complete proteins. Not the case?
Completely not the case. So proteins are made up of amino acids, okay? And some amino acids our bodies can make, and I think there's 12 or 13 we can't make. Those are called essential amino acids.
Okay.
So we have to get those from our food. And some proteins are made up of, people talk about complete proteins, so these are proteins that have all these essential amino acids and such. But it turns out that we don't absorb protein in our bodies, right? We absorb amino acids. So we eat the protein's actually broken down into the component amino acids. That's what we absorb, and then we reassemble them in our bodies to make the proteins that we need. And it also turns out that almost every food has the complete complement of amino acids. It is impossible to become deficient in an individual amino acid if you're eating a well-balanced whole food plant-based diet. It's just not physiologically possible.
We talked a little bit about antioxidants earlier today, but I know that when you go out and you give talks on the road, that's another thing that you kind of focus on. So again, just to kind of rehash there, what role do they play as far as athlete recovery?
Sure. So as I said earlier, the oxidative stress is felt to damage the cell walls actually of the muscles and ligaments, and that's what causes the stiffness and tenderness afterwards, especially the muscle soreness, right? And we can mitigate that. We have an inherent ability to mitigate some oxidative stress, but not very much, right? So the rest of that has to come from dietary antioxidants. And so in general, the more color a food has, the more highly antioxidant it is. But what's interesting is that, so we don't think of color, oftentimes when I ask people what would you think about? Well, blueberries and raspberries and strawberries, all true. But probably some of the most potent dietary antioxidants are actually legumes.
Really now?
Like red kidney beans and pinto beans and black beans. The pigments that make those dark are some of the most powerful antioxidants out there, actually.
Wow.
Also, spices, things like turmeric, ginger, oregano, cinnamon, all highly antioxidant. And then there's a few other specific foods. Tart cherry juice has a lot of, it's dark red, but it has some very highly antioxidants. Actually, there's some clinical research to show that it may help specifically prevent delayed onset muscle soreness. We know beets, highly antioxidant, but beets have another function. They increase blood flow. It's kind of nature's Viagra. It activates nitric oxide that actually dilates blood vessels.
Wow.
And in endurance athletes, there's some research that suggests you can get about a 10% increase in endurance performance. And for some track athletes, where literally it comes down to 1,000th of a second, that little bit of advantage can be huge.
Yeah, that's that edge that Chris Paul was talking
That's
about.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And I was beat loading for my long. I went on, ran 15 miles yesterday. I'm training for the Philadelphia Marathon right now. And, I do a beet shot the night before. I just take some roasted beets and put them in a blender with a little bit of lime juice. And I took one in the morning, and I drink some the next morning, the night before and some the next morning. And and again, it's just food, right? That's all. It's just food.
Beet shots with a wheatgrass chaser.
Yeah, there you go. That'll keep you out of the bars at night.
That's pretty cool, man. Let's go back. We talked about ancestors a while ago and just how different our diet was thousands and thousands of years ago. But you said really it's only been in the last 50, 60, 70 years that really things have taken a dramatic change. But before that started, this whole concept of vegetarian diets being beneficial for athletes, that was pretty well known. It's just somehow over time it's been forgotten, right?
Well, that is true. There's been a long history of vegetarian athletes dating back to ancient Greece. In the movie they talk about the Roman gladiators being vegetarian. But if you really think about foodways around the world, right? Like my mother's family came from Greece. Meat was a condiment, it was a flavoring, right? They were almost all plant-based, at least plant-focused, plant-strong. They might kill a lamb around Easter and in Greece, but most of the food was plant-based, right? You might my grandmother, might put a chicken bone in the soup to give it a little flavor, but again, it wasn't until really post-war in the United States where meat has really become, we've developed this meat-centric diet. I had the opportunity last summer to do a 3-week med school speaking tour in India. India has a huge, skyrocketing epidemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Tragically, they're suffering both ends of the malnutrition scale in many parts of India, from undernourishment and overnourishment. And you go to India and you look at a traditional Indian diet, very healthy, plant strong, but nowadays there's a McDonald's and a Pizza Hut on every KFC on every corner. And when we looked at the changes in Indian foodways, it wasn't sugar, right? It was meat, 100% increase in meat consumption and an 80% increase in edible oils, primarily palm oil, in the last 15, 20 years, which corresponds with this epidemic. So it's the fat in the diet which is driving that, and it's mainly coming from meat. So again, historic, and I led those talks off at the med school, saying, but I could give this talk in 1-2 sentences.
Yeah.
We need to start eating like you did historically, and you all need to stop eating like us. But it's true. And so, again, I think as we move to this meat-centric diet, I think that's really what's driving the epidemic of many of these chronic diseases, because of the inflammation that's associated with it.
Did you see some light bulbs go off in the room when you were giving these talks?
I did, because they have an allopathic, westernized medical system, just like the one I was trained in, British-based. We've been learning about nutrition. Again, what I learned about in nutrition class, I had maybe 2 lectures on nutrition. It was glorified biochemistry in med school.
Right.
And so I learned about protein deficiency. I learned about Kwashiorkor's disease, and I learned about scurvy, which is another disease I've never seen, vitamin C deficiency. So it was really the I learned what proteins were and carbs were. It wasn't about food, right?
Right.
It really wasn't about nutrition. It was more kind of pathophysiology of nutrient deficiency that were isolated from food.
Here's the cool thing. I think that it's not just abroad that you will start to see the light bulbs go off with, and it's not just the people in this room. Going back to athletes, they're all searching for that edge. And if you can sit down with any professional athlete, the majority of them, and have an intelligent conversation like you and I are having right now, they will be very, very receptive to this. And I think that that's why you're starting to see an increasing number of athletes turn to the plant-based diet. I want to ask you, a couple of questions about a conversation, one that I had with a player he went on a plant-based diet a few years ago, specifically because he was worried about longevity in his career, but also diabetes ran rampant in his family. He's an offensive lineman in the NFL. But after a few months, he goes to training camp, and I go up to him in his locker. I'm like, hey, man, how's the plant-based diet going? He's like, I had to stop that. I just couldn't keep the weight on. I'm not getting enough calories. You said that when you were training, you were getting 4,000 calories a day. So what is the optimal way for an athlete to healthfully make sure that they're getting the caloric needs that they need?
You have to eat a lot.
Yeah, well, for an offensive lineman, you wouldn't think that that's so difficult, right?
But no, I mean, so in those situations, what I was doing was I did a fair number of smoothies, where I would use almond milk and fruits and vegetables, so I could really cram a ton of calories into a healthful drink.
Right.
Snacked all the time, lots of fruit. This is a situation where increasing a little bit some of the more calorie-dense foods like nuts and things like that. You have to be a little bit careful, but there's ways to do it. But it is a little worried. And I think one of the misconceptions is, plant-based diet, you're just eating salad all the time, right? And it's a huge misconception. But that's not. You saw the food here tonight, right?
Yeah, okay.
A bowl of, I can smell that. It's a curry, I presume. It smells really good, and I can't wait to get a bowl in a minute.
When are there leftovers?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about plant-based diets, and honestly, after I went plant-based, my food horizons just exploded. I mean, I love to cook, and the flavors I am able to explore now, the foods, the way I can marry things together, it's really astounding. So I think that's part of the problem too, is that we think of plant-based diets, you're just eating salad all the time, which is far from, I'll have a salad every now and then, but that's not what fuels my exercise.
Oh, I know, I've seen your Instagram, man. This guy can cook. I don't know if you follow him. I think you're JF Loomis on the team. Yeah. It is incredible what you're able to do in the kitchen. You are a whiz, my friend. Let's talk about Cam Newton. Very famous Pro Bowl quarterback for the Carolina Panthers. Has had a number of injuries in recent seasons. Subsequently, we've seen his performance go down. Not as many touchdowns, a few more interceptions, blah, blah, blah. Out comes an opinion piece in the Charlotte Observer. Not even an opinion piece, because they went and they interviewed a number of sports nutritionists. And the headline essentially said that Cam Newton's deteriorating performance may be attributed to his plant-based diet. I want to read you a quote that one sports nutritionist gave. And he reads, "Go back to 2015 Cam. Badass Cam. He was a pescatarian, salmon, shrimp. You get a lot of good fats and complete protein. In fact, fish is one of the best sources that there is. Now, you take away the most valuable part of that diet, and there's just no way around it. He can't recover as well with less nutrients, with less calories, and with less muscle mass. It's just not going to happen." And he goes on to speculate that the problem really is A, he's not getting enough calories, but B, he could be deficient in B6 and B.
Statement.
Dissect it.
The thing is, if you think about chicken or fish or beef, right? Those animals are really have become the middleman for our nutrition, right? Because yes, there are healthy omega-3s in salmon, right? And there's protein, which we need, right? But where did the omega-3s come from? Right? Up the food chain, they came from plants, from marine phytoplankton and algae, right?
Yes, sir.
And when we have a choice, when we think about nutrient density, okay, I like to think of it through the lens of like we think about money, right?
Okay.
So we have extra money, we want to invest it in our financial future, and we're looking for a positive ROI. So you're an athlete, and you have a calorie to invest. You want to invest it in your future performance ROI, right? And you can invest 100 calories in broccoli or 100 calories in salmon, right? So what do you get back for that 100 calories from salmon? How much fiber? How many cancer-fighting phytonutrients, antioxidants to help mitigate some of that muscle soreness? And there's none, right? All you're getting is protein and some healthy fats. Broccoli has omega-3s, and it's also got compounds that have been shown to help prevent cancer, and on and on and on. So you're going to get a much higher performance ROI by investing your calories in foods that are nutrient dense as opposed to calorically dense. And this idea, to get back, the thing about milk and we're going to get your calcium if you don't drink milk. But where did the calcium in the milk come from? Well, it came from the grass. It actually came from the dirt that the grass grew in.
Yep.
And the cow has just served as the middleman, right?
Yep.
And they, all the fiber and all the other good stuff that was in the grass is gone, right? The cow's already used it. So, and again, I think it just gets back to this, I don't want to say, I don't think it's purposeful ignorance. I think it's just that's the paradigm we've operated in the sports world for a long time. The pervasiveness of the bro science, even the RDs, the registered dietitians are taught. They're very much schooled in this nutritional reductionism, which is in the same way I was taught to think. And so I think once you become enlightened, and when patients all you got to do is just have them keep a food diet for a day or two, and then you can see. And I've never seen a patient who was worried about protein, whether athlete or not, who kept an honest food diet for 24 hours, come in and say, "See, I told you, I'm not getting enough protein," because it just doesn't happen.
As we wrap up here, my final point that I want to make before I give you the closing thought here is that you mentioned Derek Morgan, played for the Tennessee Titans. That team featured in the Game Changers documentary. So that season that he goes plant-based and he sees his stats, his performance on the field just really shoot through the roof. And then he sees a number of his teammates follow suit. Well, the Titans hadn't made the playoffs since what, the Music City Miracle, maybe 2 decades earlier?
Well, so the last time they went to the Super Bowl was when we beat them in 99-2000, which is why I have a Super Bowl ring.
This guy, when we beat him.
My team that I was peripherally involved in, keeping healthy, how about that?
Third string. But anyway, the Titans here. Coincidence, sir? I think not.
Yeah, again, I think that it just goes to show you the power of plants. That's all.
We've had ourselves a good 45-minute conversation here. Is there anything else that you think that we should touch on before we take this one home?
No, I don't think so. If you haven't seen Game Changers, watch it. It's really a phenomenal film. And we got some pushback. There was an editorial or piece written in Men's Health that kind of made some comments, and I actually wrote a scientific rebuttal to that, which got published in Medium. But the movie really only says 3 things, really. It says that you don't have to eat meat and animal products to get big and be strong and run fast and run far. And if you don't eat meat, you will be healthier, and your loved ones will be healthier, and the world will be a better place environmentally. And then that was the message that the producers and the director really wanted to convey. And I think they did a brilliant job in conveying that. And so, again, is a piece of salmon or anything going to kill you? Of course it's not. Is there something in salmon you can't get from plants? No. Are you exposing yourself to environmental toxins like mercury? Yes. If you're eating farm salmon, it's way beyond, it's like a toxic brew. Is eating salmon good for the environment? Definitely not. And so I think that, the take-home message is that, plant-forward, a plant-strong diet, again, there's no one diet to not get diabetes, and no one diet to perform optimally, no one diet to save the planet, and no one diet, if you're compassionate about other living creatures, it's all the same. And it's just such a simple concept that I wish I would have learned a long time ago, actually.
And my final thought here is, can I tell them how old you are? Is this okay?
Sure, yeah.
So this year, my friend here, Dr. Loomis, does his very first Ironman triathlon. And if you don't know what that is, it is basically the single most grueling event known to man. I don't know who thought this up, but they are truly a glutton for punishment. You turned 60 this year.
That's right.
And you just nailed this thing.
Yeah. So that was 2 weeks after my 60th birthday. I wanted to do something epic for my 60th birthday, and so that was pretty epic. But the other thing I wanted to show people is that when we really, truly take care of ourselves, when we replicate that kind of lifestyle we're designed to lead, we're physically active, we control our stress, we recover from our stress through sleep, we eat what we're supposed to eat, we don't eat what we're not supposed to eat, that we have the ability to decouple our chronologic age from our biologic age, right? I mean, I'm going to be 61 next year, but I can guarantee you I'm much younger this year than I was last year. And so when people ask me how old I am, I tell them I'm 30 with 30 years experience.
There you go.
But honestly, that's how I feel. I mean, it really and truly is how I feel. And there are not enough pills in the pharmacy to take me from where I was 7 or 8 years ago when I needed to be on cholesterol medicine. I couldn't walk around the block without being out of breath, and I had to use an inhaler if I wanted to go jog to where I am now. And and it's the power of the plants. I'm convinced it probably drives 75% of that healthfulness, if you will.
And we talked about the DJ Swearinger late in the year and how all of his teammates were shuffling around, but the morning after the event for you, there are people in the lobby who are half your age, maybe even less. They're walking around like zombies, and you are?
I climbed Whiteface Mountain.
Day after.
That's it, yeah. So.
Amazing. Dr. Jim Loomis, you are just a wealth of information. Thank you so very much for taking the time. And thank you, everybody out here at Green Fair, Wayne Whitaker, Pericles, the entire staff. You guys are just tremendous. Give yourself a round of applause, please. And this is the Exam Room Podcast brought to you by the Physicians Committee. If you have not already done so, please plug, pull out your iPhones, your cell phones, fire up wherever it is you get your favorite shows from. Subscribe to the show right now and leave a 5-star message. And here's why I ask that. It's not for selfish reasons. It's because when you do that, it improves our rankings on Apple Podcast. And when our rankings go up, the more high profile our artwork is, and more people will click on that. And then more people will get this game-changing, and in a lot of cases, life-saving information. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever it is that you get your favorite shows from, go ahead and subscribe to the Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Leave that high rating, and we would greatly appreciate it. And you'll be doing your part to help change and save a life. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you.
All right.
We can take, if you want to take questions, I can.
Yeah,
answer
we have
them.
time for today.
Yeah,
Microphone for you.
Anybody have any questions?
big surprise, right?
So, first of all, I just want to thank Dr. Loomis for all of your contributions, in particular, the game changers. I've been on social media proclaiming 100% certainty this is absolutely, without question, the best movie ever made.
Wow.
It is
Thank
better.
you.
It is better than Star Wars. It is better than The Godfather. It is better than anything you've ever seen. The reason for that is because it takes something that is so hard to grasp, all the science, and it makes it understandable for non-scientific people like me. And all the testimonials and so forth are just absolutely dead solid perfect. Dr. Loomis is a huge part of that, huge part. And so the ripple effect that you are creating throughout the world will never actually be measured. But we are all grateful for it.
Well, thank you. Does that mean I'm getting an action figure?
A full line of marketing. So I also just wanted to mention to you, I'm actually a sports historian. And just for fun, I download like 12,000 articles from newspaper archives and read them. And actually, there was a distance runner. None of you ever heard of him because sadly his life ended in a car accident when he was very young. He would have probably become the most famous athlete on the planet if he had lived. His name was Steve Prefontaine.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So there's one line in an article about him, a total throwaway line I found fascinating. It said he would often buy meat for his housemates, but would rarely eat it himself. Now, of course, nobody back then thought to pry or poke or say, what do you, don't you eat meat? What's the matter with you? If Steve Prefontaine, perhaps the most legendary American runner in history, and an iconic godlike figure, was already onto something back then. And if he had lived longer, I would think he probably would have kept on that path and found his performance to skyrocket past everybody. And I think there's a lot of stories like that have just never been told.
No, I think you're right. I think people were, they were, I don't want to say embarrassed, but they, people, they had, it's hard enough to train every day, day in and out, but having to defend your food choices to people, people just don't have the energy to do that. And so I think a lot of it was almost kept in the closet, if you will. And that was what was so astounding about Chris Paul's statement, that it wasn't that he didn't want to tell anybody because he was concerned they'd make fun of him. It was because of he had discovered the secret bullet, the magic bullet, the secret weapon, if you will.
And they also don't want to lose their endorsements.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah, Dotsie talks about that in the movie with some, and then, and by the way, Dotsie Bowles, who's the Olympic cyclist, has a great organization called Switch for Good, and it's a not-for-profit that's trying to help athletes go dairy-free, and so she has some very interesting things about it. One reason she founded that organization was because to combat, to counteract milk's sponsorship of the U.S. Olympic Committee.
And just one word, so a physiological question. One topic I've been trying to follow, I'm not seeing very much information on it though, it is literally can be the smoking gun that ends the meat industry forever. It has to do with cortisol. So I've seen articles saying that doctors are now limiting the amount of cortisone injections that they get. I've also seen speculation that cortisol, which is basically sort of like the fight or flight that's manufactured, it's very prevalent in animals who are being humiliated, tortured, and killed right before they are done so. And that cortisol then can find its way into the meat that we ingest, and cortisol can cause cells to drive way out of control, and there you have cancer.
So, yeah, that's interesting. So, as I said earlier, if you think about our stress response, we have adrenaline to get us ready to perform physical activity, and we have cortisol to help us recover. That's one reason we give cortisol shots. But cortisol does a couple of other things. It actually will raise our blood sugar in the short term because it's trying to help you turbocharge the engine to fight the leopard. But more importantly, it stimulates our appetite in the post-stress period to help us refill the gas tank before we see the next leopard. The problem is we are running and fighting emotionally in modern society, not physically. And we're worrying about a lot more stuff than starving to death and eaten by leopards. We're about jobs and money and relationships and family and politics and traffic and weather and on and on. And then we compound it. We don't adequately rest and recover from the stress that we have. We drink too much caffeine, we drink too much alcohol, we don't get enough sleep, sleep's not restful. So what happens when we overstress and under-exercise? Because you're tell the difference, right? So when we overstress and under, that adrenaline that we're making turns against us, right? Blood pressure goes up, we get anxious, our heart palpitates, we lay in bed at night, we can't sleep, mind's racing around. But what about the cortisol? Well, blood sugar goes up, but more importantly, it leads to stress eating. And when we stress eating is a normal physiologic response, but now the problem is we didn't empty the gas tank before our brains are trying to help us fill it back up through cortisol. And so it leads to difficulty losing weight, or on and on. So health through stress management, sleep, and our nutritional health. And again, if you think about our ancestral lifestyle, stress, starving, seeing a leopard, activity, survival, rest and recovery. Doing that repetitively, that's how we build resilience, right? It's the stress. It's the stress response model, stress adaptation model. So we stress our bodies, we perform physical activity, then recover, and each time we do that, we can perform a little bit more. Well, guess what? That's a marathon training plan, right? That's a weightlifting program. So it's again, it's the maladaptation. I mean, just as an aside, I think one of the problems we have with even our healthcare today, we have, this is a new word I made up, we have diseasified many chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. Those are not diseases. Those are normal physiologic responses to abnormal behaviors. But when we treat them, when we diseasify them, and now we move to a treatment mode, we feel like we can control them, right? We're going to put you on enough medicine to get your blood pressure down, and then we stop because we've treated your disease. But it's not a disease.
You didn't catch it, you caused it.
Right, exactly. And so it's a fundamentally important concept for people to understand that, anyway, so I could talk about this all day.
Any questions?
What about mental health? You talk a lot of, just to say what about mental health? Because you talk a lot about, diabetes, hypertension.
So-
Does it help get people off their antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs?
Yes. There is increasing evidence that depression, for example, is a low-grade inflammatory disease. Okay, so we know that diets high in omega-3s and such may help improve mood. We also know that exercise plays a fundamentally important role. Study after study after study has shown that for anxiety and depression, the strongest drug you can take is not Prozac and it's not Valium, it's exercise. The other interesting thing about mental health that we're just starting to unravel is the role that our gut bacteria play in our mental health. That most of the serotonin that we make, which influences our mood, actually isn't made in our brain directly, it's made from gut bacteria. We know that people who follow a plant-based diet have different gut bacteria than people who follow a more of a Western diet. And that it may be that even some of the cravings we have for food may be driven by gut bacteria. That's just now starting to be kind of fully understood. But again, the beauty of it is the answer is the same, right? Because you go on a plant-based diet and then your gut bacteria gets better. And I can tell you that in the middle of I started training for this, the Ironman was July 20th, I started training last October. But after the first of the year, when I was in the really hard part, we had some unexpected, we had 2 nurse practitioners go out on maternity leave at the practice, and we had one of the other physicians relocated to South Dakota. So for a period of time, in my peak training, I was the only doctor at Barnard Medical managing 5,000 patients. So I'm working literally 12, 14-hour days seeing patients, and in training on top of that. So you would think that I would want to go jump off a bridge, but I tell you, I became incredibly resilient because it was a comment, because my diet really, I eat a pretty clean diet, but during the training, I really cleaned my diet up. No oil, it was all fresh stuff and tons of fruits and vegetables and on. And I was bulletproof. And I think it was a combination of the diet plus the exercise. That I wasn't stressed. It was amazing, really.
Can I add to that? Do you mind? So,
Not from an athletic standpoint, but this is something that I want to talk about so badly on the show. I just haven't had the opportunity yet. I was very overweight as a child, fast food baby basically. And I was put on antidepressants when I was, I believe, in the 6th grade. And I was on them well into my 20s. And very depressed, would miss, months of school at a time, could barely get out of the house. And I can tell you that no matter what pill I was given, until I adopted the plant-based diet, I experienced little to no benefit from that. It would get me to a certain point, but since I adopted my diet and my gut bacteria changed, my outlook on everything changed, I feel so much better. I used to dread this time of year because of seasonal affective disorder, right? Now it's like October, man, bring it on. We got the holidays coming up, I'm pumped up, it's incredible. So I do think that there's a lot of validity into that.
Question over here?
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you for hosting, Glenn, and thank you for coming here. So my question for you, Dr. Loomis, is that I've always thought of myself as a carnivore. I need that protein. My whole family eats a lot of protein. I find myself, meeting Glenn, and now I'm doing the 21-day kickstart. So I always thought I ate well. I'm eating grass-fed beef. I'm eating the pasture-raised chicken. I'm doing so good, but how do you actually transition from a life of where you're a meat eater to how do you get from A to Z? That's my question.
So when I talk to patients about it, I like to use analogies. Okay, so I think one thing that makes this so hard, dietary change so hard in general for most people is a simple fact, again, rooted in our evolutionary biology, and that is that eating is a learned behavior. And it's something you learned a really long time ago. So all of your food preferences, triggers start eating, triggers stop eating, stuff you learned a long time ago. So let's think about walking, right? So if we had to think about walking, I have to contract my quad, flex my hip, bend my knee, you would have walked right past the right berry, and you wouldn't have seen the leopard, and you wouldn't have lasted very long. So our brains evolved a mechanism when we habituate a task, very quickly our subconscious brain takes over. Okay, so driving is another example in the modern world. So take white bread, for example. White bread's not healthy, highly processed. But if the environmental trigger you learn to eat white bread is the waiter puts it on the table at the restaurant, at that moment in time, you don't have to think about eating the bread. You have to think about not eating the bread. And if you're tired of thinking, because you had a busy day at work, you're out with friends and family, what happens to the bread? Eat it, right? There's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, it almost becomes free food. Because patients come in, they say, Doc, I'm doing this plant-based thing, I don't understand, I'm not losing weight, my cholesterol's not going down, my sugars aren't better. What did you have for dinner last night? Well, I went out to had quinoa, kale salad, but what's not on the list? The 4 or 5 pieces of bread you had slathered in olive oil waiting for the food to get there. And the workplace is the worst for this kind of behavior. How do we celebrate, cupcakes for birthdays and cookies, and it's Halloween, so there's candy jars everywhere, and it's this mindless behavior, right? Now you can change it, but it's hard, right? So I mentioned earlier driving is another example. So if we can talk on the phone, listen to radio, still make our exit for the most part. If you were to move to London tomorrow and you wanted to drive, you'd have to learn how to drive on the other side of the street, right? And it would take 3 to 6 months every time you got in that car. You got to be mindful of what side of the road you're on and what side the pedestrians are coming from and how you go through the roundabout. And then one day you'll get in the car and guess what? That's how you drive. So really what this process is, it's about teaching yourself to drive on another side of the street. Okay? Now, once you learn how to drive on the other side of the street, if someone said, do you miss driving on that other side? You'd say, well, that's a silly question because I don't drive that way anymore, right? And you certainly wouldn't think about driving on the wrong side of the street in moderation, now would you? Because you would only have a moderate number of head-on collisions and run over a moderate number of pedestrians. Well, every time you eat a bowl of ice cream or a piece of bacon, you are literally running over the endothelial line of your heart, cells in your breast, cells in your colon, cells in your pancreas, on and on and on. Now, driving on the wrong side of the street in a car, the consequences are immediate and fairly potentially catastrophic. Driving on the wrong side of the road nutritionally might take decades before you have that head-on collision. You have a heart attack, get diagnosed with breast cancer or colon cancer. So how do you stay focused long enough to learn how to drive on the other side of the street, right? It's hard. So the analogy I use for that when I talk to patients is it's like pushing a snowball over the top of a mountain. And some people's mountains are really tall and the road is really steep. But if you can get the snowball over the top, you don't have to push anymore. You start to feel better. You lose weight. You like the way you look in clothes. You start to get off some of these medicines. Everything just gets better and better and better. But the hard part is getting the snowball to the top. So in my experience, having been through this myself and coached literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people through it, I think there's 3 fundamental things that have to happen. First thing is you got to find a reason to push that's important to you. And I think we talk about this the wrong way. Because we oftentimes, as clinicians, come out of a paradigm of fear, right? Quit smoking or you're going to get lung cancer. Or get your cholesterol down or you're going to have a heart attack. Or get your blood pressure down, you're going to have a stroke. Or get your sugars under control or you're going to cut your toe off or whatever. People already know that stuff. And it doesn't motivate change over the long run oftentimes. So a different way to think about it would be, why would it be important for you not to have those bad things happen? And sometimes I just do a simple exercise. You give people 5 pieces of paper, and you label 1 breast cancer, 1 stroke, and 1 heart attack, and 1 toe cut off. And you say, I want you to go home and write down the top 5 reasons you don't want these things to happen. And guess what? It comes back 1 piece of paper, right? Because it's all the same stuff. I want to run for my kids, my grandkids, my retirement. I want to, retire to the Caribbean. I want to play the top 100 golf courses in the world. Whatever it is you want to be doing in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, today is the day to start pushing the snowball to be sure that happens. Second thing is you got to figure out how to lower the slope of the road and the height of the mountain. And that's honestly and systematically thinking about what's going to make this hard for you, right? I don't know how to cook, I don't know how to shop, I don't know what quinoa is, I travel, I'm on a budget, I don't have a lot of time, I mean, on and on. There's answers to all that, and with the internet today, and you know, it's pretty easy actually to find tools that can help you overcome those barriers. And then lastly, and probably just as important, it's you really need to try to recruit as many people as you can to help you push. You know, change is hard, and we know that social networks and community play a vital role in facilitating change. And you know, whether it be friends or families or coworkers or people in the 21-day Cook Start with you or online. For example, Forks Over Knives has a 275,000 strong moderated Facebook group, so there's no trolling, and people you know, celebrate successes. They ask questions, because I guarantee you, whatever it is you're struggling with, you know, I've got to go to a barbecue next week. What should I do? There's going to be someone in there that can provide you useful advice about how to navigate the situation. So that's a long answer to the question. I personally went all in overnight. I saw Forks Over Knives laying on the couch with a statin prescription in my wallet, literally, and thought, wow. So I came back. I was in the faculty at WashU in St. Louis, so I looked up some of the research that afternoon, and that night went plant-based. Some people, you know, ease into it, but and as long as you get there eventually. Is that helpful? I don't know. That's a long answer to an easy question. I like to talk.
That's good.
Hi, Dr. Loomis. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for changing your life. So at this restaurant, I heard Dr. Joel Furman talk about the importance of intermittent fasting. And he said the science was out that would say, while 12 hours was good, 15, 16, 17 is better. And so how does that work with fueling an arduous workout?
So, yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question is about intermittent fasting. So, you know, we did evolve to undergo periods of feast and famine. And you could imagine that when you're in a famine stage and you're trying to survive to get that next meal before you starve, that if somehow the act of fasting itself could somehow boost your immune system and on and on, and that would be provide a survival advantage. And so work by Walter Longo, who's written a book called The Longevity Diet, actually suggests that intermittent fasting may in fact regenerate stem cells, increase your immunity, and such as that. We also know that intermittent fasting increases insulin sensitivity. And from an athletic standpoint, for endurance athletes, there's a concept which I utilized called train low, race high. So what that means is, what I would do oftentimes is get up in the morning and go for a 15, 18 mile run fasted. I drink lots of water, but no calories. And then that afternoon, I would fast the rest of the day. And then that afternoon, I'd hop on the bike for about 30 minutes and spin it out. So I'm glycogen depleted now, right? And then refeed after that. And there's evidence that it does two things. It increases fat, the ability to utilize fat for fuel, and also leads to glycogen supercompensation, right? So, because we only have about 3 hours worth of glycogen. You can, for most people, it's between 2 and 3 hours. You can increase a little bit through training, but we only have about enough glycogen stored for about 3 hours of exercise. We have enough fat stored for about 7 or 8, 9 days continuously. So glycogen stores best you can so you can sprint to the finish line. And the way you do that is you teach your body how to burn fat more efficiently. And so that's what these strategies are designed. It's not something you would do if you're training for a 5K or 10K. This is really only relevant if you're out doing, century bike rides and marathons and half Ironman and beyond. But it is interesting. And again, it makes sense. That would make sense to me from an evolutionary standpoint, the intermittent fast.